science and the Bible don't have to be compatible. Changing water to wine defies logic altogether, so why should the flood have to be explained perfectly by science? So the Great Flood, probably one of the earliest learned stories that we all do in Sunday school. Quick refresher. Noah was told by the Lord that the earth and all its inhabitants were utterly wicked. God had had enough. He was going to destroy them all, save Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives, and also the land animals and birds of the air. Firstly, the dimensions of the ark. In Genesis 6, we have the dimensions and specs that God instructed to design and construct the ark. Make thee an ark of gopher wood. Rooms shalt thou make in the ark, and shalt pitch it within and without with pitch. And this is the fashion which thou shalt make of it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, the breadth of it 50 cubits, and the height of it 30 cubits. A window shalt thou make in the ark, and in a cubit shalt thou finish it above. And the door of the ark shall set in the side thereof, with lower, second, and third stories shalt thou make it. So the ark was constructed using gopher wood as God instructed Noah to use. Now, this word gopher doesn't appear anywhere else in the Bible, so as to the source of the type of this wood, there's a few ideas out there. There's a chance that this type of tree was potentially lost in the flood. There's a chance maybe this type of tree was heavily harvested in the years after the flood for building. It's possibly extinct today. It is also most likely that the wood was probably simply either cypress, cedar, or a pine type of tree, and that the word gopher translates the way it does because the ark was to be built to withstand moisture and water. The ark was lined inside and outside with pitch, which is like a tar-like substance, meaning the wood had to be waterproofed. Gopher may have just been the word or the phrase used to describe the wood and its requirement to be waterproofed. The size of the ark, these cubit measurements basically mean that the ark was 145 metres long, 24 metres wide, and 15 metres tall. In fact, there's a place in the US which Uncle Mike and Auntie Ruth Steele recently have visited, and that is Auntie Ruth in the picture there, where they actually replicated and built the ark to these exact dimensions. It's a theme park based in Kentucky, and you can sort of go inside and have a look at it. It's quite interesting, looking at photos online. Just a photo up close when the ark was still half in construction there. But how long did it take Noah to build the ark? The Bible doesn't tell us precisely how long Noah took to build the ark. We know that it was after Noah was 500 years old that he fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And we know that when Noah entered the ark, his wife, 3 sons and daughters-in-laws, he was in his 600th year. So it appears that the ark took at least less than 100 years to build. After knowing these specs, we then lead on to the next obvious question: could all the animals fit on the ark? Sorry, I've gone one slide too much there. Sorry. Sorry. Before we get to that question though, I think it's really important that we discuss the floodwaters themselves and just how widespread this great event here in Genesis was, because there's 2 sort of theories that we did mention earlier. There's a conceptual idea that the flood was not actually a global flood, but rather that it was only a localized flood event and it was particular to the region that Noah was living in at the time. So was the flood global or local only? The idea of a possible local-only flood became popular back in the 16th century when the world was expanding in terms of science and population across the planet. And they sort of sat back and they tried to explain the different cultures, the animals, the great distances between the oceans that you can sort of see. So the idea of a localised flood here in Genesis became popular as it explained all these things. It sort of, in a way, answered the hard questions like, well, how did the koalas get to Australia? Because they were already in Australia. They were protected from the local flood that Noah experienced. So local flood or global flood, not discounting a local flood myself, God parted the Red Sea. He literally held back seawater in an ocean so the Israelites could cross through. He has the power to hold water. But I myself think it was a global flood. It almost seems pointless to spend all those years building an ark if the flood was only to be specific to a certain region. Probably would have been simpler that God just told Noah to potentially leave the area while he wiped everyone out for a short time. asking maybe them to go just chill on some high mountains or a different place altogether, rather than asking him to construct a huge ark and gather as many animals as he could. Noah was told to gather all the birds of the air also. Why gather all the birds of the air when they could literally just fly out of that localised flood area? Doesn't really make sense in that sense. Would also assume that when Noah had first sent out the dove in Genesis 8 to see if the floodwaters were receding, that it probably wouldn't have come back the first time because it would have found land. And we read here in Genesis, and you can probably deduce that it was a worldwide event. Genesis 7 gives us some description of how the flood happened. Rain was on the earth for 40 days. The ark was lifted up. The waters prevailed upon the earth. The high hills that were under the whole heaven, and they were covered. 15 cubits upwards did the waters prevail over the mountains. Everything that drew the breath of life was destroyed except Noah and his family. I looked up some of the heights of mountains in the area where we believe the ark sort of came to rest. But Mount Ararat, for example, is over 5,000 metres above sea level. I don't believe you can sort of have waters 5,000 metres above sea level on one side of the earth. I'm not a scientist. And not have them sort of on the other side of the earth affecting everything. Not unless God did hold the waters to the local region only, but then it sort of goes back to the whole why did you put birds on the ark kind of argument. So I do believe it is a global flood that killed everything land dwelling. There's also many passages throughout the Bible that pertain to the fact that Noah and his family survived the great flood, notably in 1 Peter 3:20 and 2 Peter 3, only Noah and his family survived the flood. 2 Peter tells us in verse 3 that in the last days there'll be scoffers who doubt that the flood even occurred. So a global flood would have meant that at least all land and air-based animals would have to be present in the ark, which then leads to the previous point or question, could all the animals have actually fit in the ark? Genesis 7 tells, take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and his mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean, and the male and his mate, and 7 pairs of the birds of heaven also, male and female, to keep their offspring alive on the face of all the earth. So at least a pair of all creatures, and of the clean animals, 7 pairs. For these animals were probably intended to be eaten or offered as sacrifice unto God. So could all of the animals on the face of the earth fit? This is one of those questions that you can sort of get caught up looking up YouTube videos for 10 hours straight, trying to find whether it actually works or not. But to date, scientists have characterised about 2 million different types of land-based species. They also estimate this number could be another million more on top of that that have yet to even be discovered. So in short, no, you probably couldn't fit 2 million types of creatures. 2 million, which would at least be doubled to 4 million because they would require a male and female pair on the ark. Now there is an explanation, it's a theory, of how this number may have been drastically reduced. You may have heard of it. But in Genesis 6, verse 19, it says, and of every living thing of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of the birds according to their kinds, and of the animals according to their kinds. Of every creeping thing of the ground according to its kind, 2 of every sort shall come into you to keep them alive. Also take with you every sort of food that is eaten and store it up. It shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah was to take of every sort of every kind of animal, meaning, this is the theory, we'll use dogs as an example and I hope I'm explaining it better, but you imagine all the different varieties and subspecies of canine variants and breeds that we have today, bulldogs, poodles, wolves, coyotes, dingoes, hyenas even. The list is sort of endless, but this theory suggests that they may have all come from a similar kind or a type. You think of the offhand of the different types of they may have come from one pair of canines and sort of genetically mutated from there. Same theory can be applied to zebras and horses, donkeys. They all have a similar kind or type if you sort of look at them. You think offhand of the different types of spiders that we have. They may have come from a single pair or a few single pairs of spiders even. This theory suggests that if you were to characterize the number of species, and sort them into kinds of category, if you did that, then scientists themselves have suggested the number of actual of animals required could be anywhere between 10 or 50,000. Between 10 or 50,000 types of animals or kinds that had to be on the ark. The idea of the theory here is that God, in his infinite power, perhaps, and I'm no scientist, but perhaps he created genetic mutation to happen after the ark landing, and you sort of got all the different types of animals that we see today. Do remember, God is not limited by science, because we do remember that Noah was actually 600 years old when he got on that ark. I'm 34, and I couldn't see myself getting to 600, honestly. But that defies science altogether, 600 years old. I did actually come across this article from the Smithsonian magazine online that was written a while back. It was based by 4 physics students who are based in the UK, and they were going about studying what information was written in the Bible in Genesis and trying to either prove or disprove the possibility of the ark being able to survive both the flood and house the required animals that we have in the world today. I have paraphrased their study in the interest of time, of course. But in their study, the students did the following. They decided to use the maths to work out that the ark was basically 144 metres long, 24 metres wide, and 14.46 metres tall. They went with cypress wood as their material for the construction of the ark, although pine and cedar are very similar in density. Using the density of cypress, they calculated the weight of this hypothetical ark to 1.2 million kilos. Based on the density of the seawater, they figured out that an empty box-shaped ark would float with its hull dipping only 0.34 metres below the ocean line. They then considered an ark filled with human and animal cargo. Working backwards with maths that's well beyond my understanding, they calculated the maximum weight of the ark would hold while staying afloat. Forcing the bulk of the ark down into the water while keeping it afloat would displace about 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of seawater. Knowing the volume of this displaced seawater, and knowing that an object in water displaces its own weight, if that makes sense, they crunched the numbers and found the total mass needed to displace the water. They subtracted the mass of an empty ark and found that the ark could hold about 50 million kilos. For some perspective, the average sheep is about 23 kilos, so hypothetically, the biblical boat could have held about 2.15 million sheep. Fitting 2 of each of the world's animals in the ark was an entirely different matter, and scientists question how many species Noah would have needed to save to produce the modern population of species that inhabit our planet today. Scientists have characterised about 1.7 million species to date. So the students argue that if the average mass of species represented on the ark was the average mass of a sheep, the ark could theoretically have been able to accommodate them all without capsizing. However, some estimates guess that we have many more millions of undiscovered species. So could they have handled all those extra species? It was probably not likely, but they used that theory that I mentioned earlier about types and kinds of animals, and instead the scientists, these 4 physics students, worked through, and they actually found their guesses estimated put Noah's cargo from anywhere from 10,000 to 50,000 animals on that ark. Their closing commentary suggests that the story from Genesis and the specs that were given to Noah thousands of years ago do at least pass the test of modern day science. The ark both could have floated and potentially housed the required animals. They mention the story of Noah's Ark does have plausibility in today's modern world, and that the study was given by 4 non-religious scholars. So how did the flood occur exactly? Genesis 7 verse 11 tells us, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of heaven were opened, and rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. So we do know that it at least rained on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. There was a great amount of rain upon the earth, but what about these great fountains of the deep? So in short, it is guessed that fountains of the Great Deep are possibly oceanic or subterranean, meaning underground sources of water. In the context of the flood account, it could mean both. Now, there's been a number of theories in regards to what it means for the great fountains of the Great Deep to burst forth. There are theories such as the subterranean underground sources of water that eventually came up in the flood that may have been trapped in the week of creation. But the one I find most interesting deals with a theory of what is called runaway subduction, and it's part of a theory based off catastrophic plate tectonics. So the Earth's crust, even below the water, is made up of plates, more commonly referred to as tectonic plates. These are the plates that, when they sort of hit one another, they do cause earthquakes around the globe. Now, the outermost thin layer, called the crust, is home to life on Earth. It's the surface you walk on, it's the mountains that you can see, any other landscapes that you can see, that's what the crust is. As vast as what this layer may seem, it only makes up for about 1% of the planet. The mantle resides beneath the crust. This region makes up roughly 84% of the Earth. The crust and part of the upper mantle move around due to convection, which is a movement of heat from the Earth's interior. This is called plate tectonics. So basically, the crust and sort of the upper mantle, they just move around very slowly, and that's what's called plate tectonics. Currently, the Earth's plates move around very slowly, but even old Earth geologists agree that the rates have fluctuated greatly over time. Now, you may have heard of the Pangea, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that concept, that our current continents that we see today were once actually mushed together in one big continent, which scientists do called Pangea. In 1859, a geologist called Antonio Snyder Pellegrini noticed that the jigsaw puzzle of North and South America with Europe and Africa, if the Atlantic oceans were all and other oceans were all closed up, sort of fit together. He sort of then went back, opened his Bible, read in Genesis, and realised that the landmass God formed on day 3 of creation week very well could have been a supercontinent. That this supercontinent then broke up during the flood, and a process called continental sprint, which is the rapid movement of land masses, opened up all today's oceans. Thus was born the model which is called catastrophic plate tectonics. It provides a physical mechanism for the flood. At the initiation of the flood, the fountains of the Great Deep broke up, ripping apart the pre-flood supercontinent. The upwelling molten rock from the underlying mantle, which is underneath the Earth's crust there, basically helped propel continental fragments across the globe, literally ripping apart the world that Noah potentially lived in. And opened up, new oceans were formed, and the plates ran into each other, forming today's mountains that we do see. It makes sense as there's a definite jigsaw match that we can sort of see there that would sort of fit. But scientists do have a theory, and they see evidence that there was perhaps even a different supercontinent prior to Pangea, designated Rodinia. It's an artist's impression, as there's much speculation as to what the supercontinent could have looked like, but Rodinia could have been the first supercontinent, with some scientists who reviewed the young Earth creation theory would say that it was what God created on day 3, when he gathered the water to one place and let land appear, which is found in Genesis 1 verse 9. Now, the theory goes that Rodinia, which was perhaps the land that was God created in Genesis 1, broke up during the flood. And as it broke up, the plates actually then smashed back together to form Pangea. Evidence indicates that the continents have moved around, they've broken up, they've crashed back together, but the pieces have remained fairly constant. Geologists call these cores cratons, and they seem to have remained somewhat stable and present throughout all history. The supercontinent Snyder Pellegrini reconstructed, which is known by geologists as Pangea. With modern scientists, it is now known Pangea could not have been the pre-flood supercontinent. Something must have occurred earlier to produce the features on Pangea. And this is what scientists have sort of found, but When they remove the Atlantic Ocean and they put the pieces back together again, they find a big long mountain chain that ran from North America through Europe. The problem with this chain, however, which is known as the Appalachian Caledonian Mountains, it's made out of fossil-bearing sediments that were deposited earlier in the flood. The only way to form a mountain chain like this is for one continent to collide with another continent. This means that the flood had to deposit fossil-bearing sediments, layers in North America and Europe, before they actually crashed back into each other to form Pangaea. Thus, Pangaea cannot have been the pre-flood supercontinent that Noah lived on. It could have only been a temporary merger of continental fragments during the flood, lasting no more than a few weeks. Pangaea was a supercontinent during the flood, but it was completely underwater. No questions? Everyone's good? Scientists have speculated that worldwide flood may actually explains the Rodinia-Pangaea concept far better than introducing millions of years of movements. They've said that the speed needed for topography we see today and the growth of land connecting the original plates via flood sediments heavily favours the probability that it was some form of cataclysm that caused Rodinia to break up. And this is where, this is where the theory of runaway subduction comes in. In general terms, subduction is what happens when a plate moves sideways and down against another plate, causing the edge of one plate to sink in under another. In runaway subduction, this process leads to a chain reaction. One plate sinking so fast it generates a lot of heat, which causes the other plates to weaken and sink in turn. A side effect of this process would be extreme fountains of water erupting along plate edges, literally fountains of the deep breaking forth. Furthermore, the process would have caused the cooler crust plates to descend, while warm mantles seeped over the top to create new crust. Those new plates would be far hotter, and because all the Earth's crust technically floats on that upper mantle, the hot plates would literally rise dramatically. Any water atop these plates literally would have rose accordingly, with guesses by scientists estimated potentially as much as 2,500 metres. If this worldwide cataclysm happened, this alone would have actually caused worldwide flooding. Now, there's further evidence that this was a probable scenario as well. A scientific method called seismic tomography is a form of modelling that uses earthquake waves to construct what the Earth's interior looked like. And with it, we can see plates that used to be on the surface but have descended into the mantle over time as they hit other plates. Remembering the interior mantle is hot and gets hotter the further you go in. These particular scientists, using high-tech imagery, have noted the descending slabs, some of which have traversed 1,500 kilometres into the Earth's mantle, where temperatures are over 6,000 degrees, that these plates are distinctly cooler. The catastrophic plate tectonic model suggests subduction or plate movement during the flood year occurred very rapidly, with plates moving at rates of metres per second and potentially 3 kilometres per hour. These fast speeds could have easily placed long slabs of cold earth that used to be on top, deep within the Earth's surface, within the hot mantle as we observe today. Since the slabs have only been within the mantle for a few thousand years, then they're much cooler than the surrounding mantle. Now, I'll give you a moment to read that while I have a drink. Scientists have concluded, and that's their official statement. You have to read it a few times, but scientists concluded that these cooler plates that are deep within the Earth's mantle are far better explained by the catastrophic Earth event some 4,500 years ago. That explains why there are cold slabs so deep inside the Earth's mantle that are not the same temperature as the mantle around them. While searching further for more flood evidence we might have, I did find that we have stories of the flood in a vast variety of cultures from across the globe. Whilst trawling through countless information on the web about the Great Flood, I did find an interesting study which was published which reviews the possibility of a worldwide flood and whether this story was relevant and contained only to biblical records. The paper's published online. I grabbed some small parts of the information, but it appears that the story of Noah's Ark is not just contained to the Bible only, but is found in many other ancient cultures in varying degrees on a worldwide scale. I am paraphrasing from various parts of the published study. There were a number of people that sort of published in this paper, so I am just mentioning by their surnames. One author named Strickling concluded that from his study of flood legends from all over the world, that nearly all flood accounts are variations of the theme of the biblical account. However, a statistical analysis indicates the purity of the biblical account and reveals evidence of subsequent upheavals having corrupted in varying degrees on all other accounts. Among the similarities that Strickling found included a favoured family was saved in 32 of the flood accounts, and in 21, survival was due to a boat of some type. He concluded that a correlation exists between the following areas: survival by boat, a forewarning, one flood only, and preservation of non-human types of life such as animals. The same correspondence with the biblical account is also found in worldwide creation accounts. A different author named Warshawski notes regarding the Great Flood with variations, the biblical account of a great universal flood is part of the mythology and legend of almost every culture on Earth. Even people living far from the sea, the Hopi Indians in the American Southwest, the Incas in South America, have legends of a great flood covering the tops of mountains and wiping out virtually all life on Earth. In a study of over 200 creation myths, Morris found similarities and calculated the frequency of certain themes in each such one compared to the basic fundamentals of the biblical record. An author named Morris concluded from his study, one of the strongest evidences for the global flood which annihilated all people on Earth except for Noah and his family has been the frequent presence of flood legends in folklore of people groups from all around the world. Morris further said, local geography and cultural aspects may be present, but they all seem to be telling the same story. Morris argued that research indicates that often a myth is a faded memory of a real event. Details may have been added, lost, or obscured in the telling and retelling, but the kernel of truth remains. When two separate cultures have the same myth in their body of folklore, their ancestors must have either experienced the same event or both descended from a common ancestral source which itself experienced the event. Another part of this paper written by a different author made mention of similar things, but had the conclusional point which reads, he said that among the common myths in the world's history, no other one is so widespread as the story of the flood. From China to the American Indians and even the pre-Columbian Indians, one finds in strange forms the myth of the Great Flood. Most of these myths have weird elements, foolish elements. For example, the description of the boat that was used. In the Bible, these strange and foolish elements are not there. We could say then that the Bible gives us the history of the flood. The myths all over the world are contorted, but show that men everywhere have a memory of it. Here in the Bible is the one flood story whose details, including the construction of the vessel, are actually reasonable. In addition to these kinds of commentaries, it makes all the more believable for the concept of a global flood, and that these stories found in different various cultures from around the earth all had a single point of origin, that being the story found here in Genesis. Most of these cultures that do contain a flood narrative generally all seem to be clustered furthermore around the Middle East region. These cultures worldwide that do contain flood narratives, Aztecs, Incas, Indigenous Australia, and even Hawaii, are stories of the Great Flood actually found. Hawaiians have a flood story that tells of a time, long after the death of the first man, that the world became wicked, it became a terrible place, and only one good man was left. And his name was, and forgive the pronunciation, his name was Nu-U. He made a great canoe with a house on it and filled it with animals. And in this story, the waters came up and all the earth, covered all the earth and killed all the people. Only Nu-U and his family were actually saved. These researchers all came to similar points. The story of the Great Flood is contained in a huge amount of world cultures. It actually seems to fit. Noah and his sons and their wives would have left the ark, and some 100 odd years later the Tower of Babel story occurs, which possibly explains the various cultures spreading across the globe, having fresh stories probably told to them of the Great Flood. Leading to one final point I actually found quite interesting. Today the Earth has a rough population of 7.8 billion people. If we do support and go with a worldwide flood concept, then we have to agree that potentially the world's population must have stemmed from Noah's 3 sons and wives. So is there any evidence that could potentially prove that this was an actual thing? Could you get from the end of the flood, and providing Noah only had 3 sons with wives, reach a population of 7.8 billion people in the year 2022? And so while doing more trawling through countless pages about the flood, I came across a few pages which are actually dedicated to proving that the concept of Noah's 3 sons who survived the flood a rough 4,500 years ago could have actually in fact repopulated the whole world to the 7.8 billion we have today. Interest of time, I will try and keep it brief. It's very confusing, but yeah. I don't do them justice entirely about trying to explain the mathematical approach that they took to this. This paper that I sort of read was about 30 pages long, so I just sort of had to grab the meaty parts out. But the mathematical approach that they took to figuring out the numbers, the people who made this program, it was a computer program, came to the first statement that to reach a population of 7.8 billion people from 3 founding couples, Noah's sons and their wives, that you'd need a minimum population growth rate of 0.464%. Now this computer program, which was developed, was built to incorporate a huge amount of factors, such as a variation of childbearing ages, of females born, and then calculating minimum time required until those females could themselves reach a childbearing age. It took into account age, lifespans, and ran simulations of people living to at least 60 years, maxed them out to possibly living to 125 years for certain years where it does record that people did live much longer in the early Bible times. The program took into account the probability of a woman bearing a child as they got older, and that obviously went down as women got older. The program simulations also took into account factors such as wars, famine, disease, sickness, early death during childbearing. It was designed to factor in a huge amount of scenarios and the likelihood of females being able to bear children at different ages. The simulation was run over 1,000 times with a variety of scenarios and factors put into place. The conclusion of the program was that almost every single time a population growth rate of 0.64% was easily reached, and most of the time exceeded in all simulations. The conclusion they came up with is that there's no question as to whether you could actually reach today's world population of 7.8 billion people from only 3 founding couples since the flood 4,500 odd years ago. In conclusion, I do hope some of this stuff has been interesting. Sorry if there's too much science and boring stuff in there. There's a ton of information out there. There's a heap of stuff that I didn't get to put up here tonight, which you're glad about. You may have your own cool little theories. I don't want to discuss them afterwards. My throat hurts. And look, regardless of how the flood occurred and whether it was local or global, we might not have it anywhere near 100% right. You might be sitting there burning that I'm presenting a certain idea tonight. My advice in doing my own research is not to get too caught up in chasing theories and trying to prove that the flood occurred in every single minor detail. I have my own point that I remind myself of constantly. If the flood event was so obvious to modern day science and there was literally no evidence that supported the world existing outside from its creation 6,000 odd years ago, then it would be so obvious to the world population that there is a God. And then there wouldn't be actual scoffers in the last days. Yep. Everyone gets that? Yep. The real point to focus on though, and 2 Peter 3 highlights it I think, The world and its population was destroyed in Noah's day because of their wickedness. We're told that there's another such day coming, the day of the Lord. There will be a very similar day of reconciliation coming, and the world's population simply don't believe it. And whether the flood of Noah's day was local or global, the day coming will not just be a local event, it will be of global proportions.